Denise Carter learned the weight of a small box before she ever held it. It started in that hollow stretch after the hospital, after the paperwork, after the last handshake that felt too warm for the moment. People tell you grief is heavy, but they never mention how light certain objects are and how that lightness can make you furious. A ring, a wallet, a folded program, a plastic hospital band in the bottom of a purse. Things that should not matter, but suddenly become the only proof you were not imagining a life. Her husband, Harold, had been careful all his life. The kind of man who kept receipts, kept warranties, kept his word. He was a transit mechanic until his knees gave up, then a school bus driver because he still wanted to work and still wanted to be useful. He had a way of calming a room without performing for it. Just presence, just steadiness. Denise had been his steadiness right back. They were not wealthy, not struggling in the dramatic way people like to film, but always paying attention. A modest home, a mortgage that took years off their backs, a church that felt like family, and a small circle of friends who did not need to talk much to know what was happening. Harold had a heart condition that behaved until it did not. A bad week turned into a hospital stay. A hospital stay turned into decisions nobody feels qualified to make. When he died, there was no cinematic moment, no clean closure, just a nurse with practiced gentleness, forms, and a room that went quiet in a way that felt wrong. Denise signed where she was told, listened where she could, and somehow drove home without remembering the roads. 2 days later, she sat at her kitchen table with a legal pad and a pen that kept slipping in her sweaty fingers. She wrote Harold's name over and over. Full name, middle initial, date of birth, last 4 of his Social Security, the only numbers she could keep straight. She wrote the hospital, the unit, the time she was called. She wrote the name of the nurse. She wrote the name of the doctor who had explained things too late. It was not romance, it was survival. Denise had learned long ago that systems respected paper, not pain. The funeral home was recommended by someone at church, a place that had served families for decades, the kind that called itself compassionate and professional. Denise drove there in the mid-morning, wearing a black dress she had owned for years, clutching a folder full of documents that now seemed to be her entire identity. The building sat on a corner with trimmed hedges and a sign that looked expensive in an understated way. Inside it smelled like flowers and furniture polish and something else, something that tried to pretend death was just another service. A white funeral director greeted her with a soft voice and clean hands. He spoke slowly, as if Denise might break if he used normal speed. She did not need slow. She needed precise. She needed correct. She handed him the paperwork. He copied names and dates onto forms that looked pre-printed and official. He asked about the service, the music, the program, the casket, the viewing. Denise made the choices as if she were ordering supplies for a job. She forced herself to think in steps. If she stayed in steps, she would not dissolve. Harold had wanted cremation. He had said it plainly years earlier, like he was talking about tires. Denise had promised she would do it the way he asked. It felt like the last promise she could still keep. The director explained the process. There would be authorization forms. There would be a transfer from the hospital. There would be identification protocols. There would be a timeline. He used words like chain of custody without saying chain of custody, because funeral homes prefer softer phrases. Denise heard the hard meaning anyway. A body would move from place to place. A person would touch. A label would be placed. A tag would be checked. A log would be filled. A service would be performed. Every step was supposed to have a signature. Denise signed the cremation authorization with a hand that shook once, then steadied. She initialed the line about personal effects. She initialed the line about identification. She signed a line about receiving the cremated remains in an urn or container. The director said the ashes would be ready within a certain number of days, and the funeral home would call her to schedule pickup. She walked out into sunlight that felt disrespectful. The service was held the following week. Harold's photos were arranged on a table. His work friends came in their best clothes and stood with their hands folded like they did not know what to do with them. The pastor spoke of faith and endurance and the kindness Harold had shown without making a show of it. Denise sat in the front row, knees pressed together, eyes dry, because if she cried, she was afraid she would never stop. People hugged her afterward with the same sentence over and over, and she let it happen, because that is what a widow does when the room needs closure more than she does. When the service ended, the funeral home staff cleared the chairs, stacked programs, and moved with the efficiency of a team that did this every day. Denise watched them and felt a strange flicker of comfort. At least somebody knew what they were doing. That flicker died later. A week after the service, Denise received a call from the funeral home. The voice on the line belonged to a receptionist, cheerful in tone but strained underneath. The receptionist said there was an issue with Harold's cremated remains. She said the funeral director would call Denise back. Denise asked what kind of issue. The receptionist said she did not have details. Denise hung up and stared at her phone as if it were a faulty appliance. She waited. Then she called back. She asked for the director directly. She was told he was in a meeting. She asked when he would call. She was told soon. Soon stretched. By late afternoon, Denise drove to the funeral home without announcing she was coming. Her hands were steady on the steering wheel in a way that surprised her. She parked and walked in and asked to speak to the director. The receptionist's smile tightened when she saw Denise's face. She asked Denise to wait in the lounge. Denise sat on a sofa that felt too soft, under framed artwork that tried to turn grief into scenery. Minutes passed. A man in a suit walked by without looking at her. Another staff member brought a cup of water and set it down like a peace offering. Denise did not touch it. Finally, the director appeared with his hands clasped in front of him. He did not sit. He stood and spoke with the same soft voice. But now it sounded rehearsed. He told Denise there had been a discrepancy. He told her their crematory partner had reported a labeling problem. He told her they were working to resolve it. Denise asked where Harold's ashes were. The director said they were not able to release the remains at this time. Denise asked whether Harold had been cremated. The director said the process had occurred, but there were administrative issues. Denise heard her pulse in her ears. Administrative issues. That phrase was for billing mistakes, not for a person. She asked again, slower, where Harold's ashes were at that moment. The director said they were secured. Denise asked who had them. The director said the crematory did. Denise asked for the crematory's name, address, and contact. The director hesitated, then offered a name, but spoke as if he hoped Denise would not write it down. Denise wrote it down anyway, right there on the back of a folded program still in her purse. She asked for their documentation, the logs, the tag numbers, the signatures. The director said those were internal documents. Denise asked whether the funeral home had a chain of custody record. She did not dress the phrase up. She used it like a tool. The director's face changed. Just slightly. A flicker of annoyance, quickly buried. He said the funeral home had protocols. Denise asked to see them. He said he could not provide those documents without management approval. Denise asked who management was. He said the owner. Denise asked for the owner. The director said the owner was unavailable. Then, without warning, the conversation took a turn that felt like a slap. The director's voice hardened. He said there were concerns about the integrity of the remains. He said there had been a report that Denise had attempted to take the cremated remains without authorization. He said the funeral home was obligated to protect the property until matters were clarified. Denise stared at him. Property. Her husband reduced to a word used for furniture. She asked who made that report. The director said it was an internal concern. Denise felt heat rise up her neck. She asked whether he was accusing her of trying to steal her own husband's ashes. The director did not say yes. He did not say no. He said the funeral home could not release remains until identification was confirmed. Denise realized in that moment that the problem was not just missing paperwork. The problem was that someone needed an explanation that made the funeral home look competent. A labeling discrepancy could become a scandal. A widow could become a convenient suspect. Denise stood up. She told the director she wanted everything in writing. She told him she wanted a copy of every document she had signed, a receipt for the body transfer, a log of who had handled Harold, and the name of the person who decided she was a risk. The director's face tightened again. He asked her to lower her voice. Denise realized she had raised it without meaning to. Not shouting, just sharper. The kind of tone people call aggressive when it comes from the wrong mouth. Denise took one step toward the counter and asked the receptionist for the paperwork. The receptionist looked to the director. The director made a small motion with his hand, like pushing an invisible button. 2 uniformed officers entered the building. Denise did not see them come in. She only felt the air change when the receptionist's eyes flicked past Denise's shoulder, and then the sound of boots on tile approached with purpose. The officers were white, calm, and professional in the way officers can be when they are confident they control the room. One asked Denise what the problem was. The director stepped in and spoke quickly, using the same tone he had used with Denise at first, soft and careful. He said Denise was distressed. He said she was demanding access to remains that could not be released. He said she had become disruptive. Denise stood still and felt something inside her go cold. Disruptive. That was the label that opened doors for them, the kind of door that did not open for her. An officer asked Denise to step outside and calm down. Denise told them she was calm. She told them she was asking for documentation. She told them the funeral home had refused. She told them she had a right to know where her husband's ashes were. The officer listened and nodded as if he understood, and spoke as if to a child. He said this was a civil matter. He said the funeral home had the right to refuse service. He said Denise needed to leave the property. Denise looked around the room and saw 2 older white couples in the hallway, waiting for a meeting. They watched her. One woman's face held curiosity mixed with judgment. Another looked away quickly, as if she did not want to be involved. Denise could feel herself becoming a scene. The director stood behind the officers, hands clasped, expression composed. He had created the image he needed: a widow out of control, a funeral home maintaining order, police called for safety. Denise knew what arguing in that moment would do. It would turn her into the story they wanted. She swallowed her anger, nodded once, and walked out with her head up. The officers followed her to the door, not touching her, but close enough to make sure she understood the boundaries of her body in that space. Outside, Denise stood on the sidewalk, breathing slowly. She felt her hands trembling now, not from fear, from insult, from the humiliating fact that Harold's last place on earth had just treated her like a thief. She drove home and sat at her kitchen table again, and this time she cried. Not pretty crying, the kind that leaves your throat raw and makes you hate your own lungs. When she stopped, she wiped her face and opened her folder. She pulled out every document she had. She laid them on the table in order. She stared at the signatures. She stared at the dates. She stared at the funeral home's letterhead. Then she began doing what Denise did best when someone tried to corner her. She turned grief into procedure. She called the crematory whose name she had written down. The receptionist who answered sounded surprised to hear from a family member. Denise asked whether Harold Carter had been cremated there. The receptionist said she could not confirm without a case number. Denise asked for the case number. The receptionist said she did not have it. Denise asked who did. The receptionist transferred her to a supervisor. The supervisor sounded cautious. He asked Denise for the funeral home name. He asked for Harold's date of death. Denise provided it. The supervisor said there had been a labeling discrepancy that week. He said it was being reviewed. He said he could not discuss specifics. Denise asked whether Harold's remains had been cremated. The supervisor said yes, the cremation had occurred. Denise asked where the cremated remains were now. The supervisor said they were secured pending identification confirmation. Denise asked who was doing the confirmation. The supervisor said the funeral home. Denise asked for the chain of custody log. The supervisor said they maintained internal logs and could not provide them to the public without a request through the funeral home. Denise asked whether the crematory had a state license. The supervisor said yes. Denise asked for the licensing board information. The supervisor paused. Then he gave it to her, as if he could sense Denise would not stop. Denise called the state board that regulated funeral establishments and crematories. She explained calmly that her husband's ashes were being withheld, and she had been accused of attempting to take them. She said police had been called on her. She said the funeral home refused to give her documentation. She asked what her rights were. The board employee listened and asked for the funeral home name, address, the director's name, and the timeline. Denise gave it. The employee asked whether Denise had signed the cremation authorization. Denise said yes. The employee asked whether Denise had a receipt for the transfer from the hospital. Denise said she had not been given one. The employee said funeral homes were required to maintain records. The employee said Denise could file a formal complaint. The employee said Denise could request records in writing. Denise wrote a letter that night, not an emotional letter, a clean one. She requested a complete copy of all documents in Harold's file, including intake, identification, transfer, cremation authorization, crematory work order, chain of custody logs, and release documentation. She requested the name of the crematory and the date of cremation. She requested a written explanation for the decision to contact police. She requested the funeral home's policies regarding remains release and family access. She mailed it, certified. She kept the receipt. The next day, she did another thing that felt strange but necessary. She contacted a local attorney who handled consumer protection and civil rights cases. Not because she wanted money, not yet, but because she wanted someone in a suit to translate her pain into consequences. The attorney's office took her call and scheduled a consultation. Denise sat in a waiting room with magazines that felt obscene in their normality. She explained the story in a steady voice. She told the attorney the funeral home had implied she was stealing. She told the attorney police had escorted her out. She told the attorney the ashes were being withheld. The attorney asked one question that made Denise blink. He asked whether she believed the funeral home had actually lost the ashes. Denise did not want to believe it, but the answer came out of her mouth anyway. She said yes. She believed that was exactly what had happened. The attorney nodded as if he had heard this kind of thing before. He asked for the documents Denise had. He asked for the names. He asked for dates. He asked whether Denise had recorded any calls. Denise said no. She said she had not thought of it. The attorney told her to begin documenting everything. He told her to request all communications in writing. He told her not to argue over the phone. He told her quietly that funeral homes and crematories were supposed to be meticulous, and when they were not, they often tried to move blame away from themselves fast. He told her the police call was not accidental. It was leverage. It was intimidation. It was a signal that Denise should stop asking questions. Denise felt her face heat. She asked whether it was legal to call police on her like that. The attorney said anyone could call police, but that did not mean it was justified, and it did not mean it would look good once a paper trail existed. Paper trail. Those words landed like a hook in Denise's mind. Because if there was one thing Denise trusted, it was that people wrote down their true intentions when they thought nobody outside their office would see it. The funeral home responded to Denise's certified letter a week later with a thin packet. It included copies of the documents Denise had signed. It included a receipt for payment. It included a generic statement about a labeling discrepancy and an ongoing review. It did not include the chain of custody log. It did not include the crematory work order. It did not include a date of cremation. It did not include any explanation for the police call. It included instead a short letter saying the funeral home was cooperating with appropriate authorities and Denise should refrain from contacting staff directly. Appropriate authorities. Denise stared at the letter and felt something shift. The funeral home was trying to put her outside the process. They were trying to control the channel of communication. They were trying to make her feel like the problem. Her attorney sent a demand letter. It requested full documentation and immediate clarification of the location and identity of Harold's remains. It warned of litigation. It referenced state regulations about records retention and proper identification protocols. It also demanded that any insinuation of wrongdoing by Denise be retracted unless supported by documented evidence. The funeral home did not respond with humility. They responded with defense. Their attorney replied that the funeral home had acted responsibly, The letter claimed Denise had become disruptive. It claimed staff feared for their safety. It claimed the funeral home had a duty to protect sensitive remains. It claimed the crematory reported a labeling issue, and therefore, the funeral home had to delay release. Denise read the letter and felt a grim, almost detached clarity. They were writing their story now. They were planting words that would later be repeated. The attorney filed suit. Not as a dramatic headline thing, but as a procedural step to force discovery, to force documents into daylight, to force sworn testimony, to stop the funeral home from hiding behind vague phrases. The complaint alleged negligence, breach of contract, emotional distress, and discriminatory treatment. It also requested injunctive relief, a court order requiring the funeral home to produce the remains or provide a verified explanation of what had happened. The funeral home's response was what Denise expected: denial, deflection, more language about safety and procedure. But once the case moved into discovery, the tone shifted. Suddenly, the funeral home had to answer questions, not just send letters. Denise's attorney served requests for production: chain of custody logs, crematory work orders, internal incident reports, training manuals, surveillance footage, call logs, communications between the funeral home and the crematory, communications about Harold, communications about Denise, communications about the police call, communications about any labeling discrepancies in the relevant time window. The funeral home objected. They claimed burden. They claimed privacy. They claimed relevance. They offered partial production. The attorney pushed back. He filed motions. He requested a hearing. In the months between filings, Denise lived in a strange, split world. In the morning, she went to work. She smiled at co-workers. She answered emails. She attended church. She thanked people for casseroles she could not taste. At night, she sat at her kitchen table with documents and made herself read them even when her eyes burned. Grief did not pause for litigation. It just learned to share the room. One afternoon, a court order arrived granting the motion to compel. The judge required the funeral home to produce certain records, including communications related to the handling of Harold's remains and the decision to involve police. The order included a deadline. Denise read the order twice, then held the paper against her chest the way she used to hold the folder. Not because it comforted her, but because it was proof that somebody in authority had, at least briefly, listened. The funeral home produced a new batch of documents. Some were boring: routine forms, intake sheets, inventory lists, a crematory invoice with a case number, a log with initials and times. Denise studied the log like it was a map. Harold's name was on it, but a line through it appeared next to another name, and a handwritten note sat in the margin. Denise did not understand the note at first. Then, she realized it referenced a label correction. Her attorney asked for clarification. The funeral home responded with vague explanations about administrative updates. Then, in the next production, the emails arrived. Not all at once. Not cleanly. A dump of messages with attachments, some missing, some duplicated, some clearly threaded. Denise's attorney had to reconstruct the timelines. He asked for metadata. He asked for complete chains. The funeral home resisted, again. Then the judge ordered them again. This is how Denise learned, painfully, that institutions do not confess in a single dramatic moment. They bleed truth slowly when you apply steady pressure. The first email that mattered was not explosive. It was mundane. A staff member writing to another about a mix-up at the crematory. The subject line was bland. The content was cautious. It referenced a tag discrepancy. It mentioned that the funeral home needed to handle family communications carefully. Handle family communications carefully. Denise felt her stomach tighten, because nowhere in that email did anyone mention Denise's husband as a person. They referenced him as a case, a file, a unit that needed managing. They referenced Denise not as a widow, but as a risk. Another email followed, this one between the funeral director and the owner. It mentioned that the crematory had mistakenly processed 2 cases with swapped identifiers. It mentioned that the cremated remains were in the building, but their identity could not be confirmed without additional verification. It mentioned the possibility of contacting the crematory for retesting, a process that would delay release. Then came the sentence that made Denise's fingers go numb. It referenced the need to control the narrative because a public complaint would be damaging. Control the narrative. Denise leaned back in her chair and felt the room tilt. She had been treated like a criminal so they could control the narrative. That was not a misunderstanding. That was a strategy. A later email referenced Denise by name. It stated she had arrived demanding documents. It described her as confrontational. It suggested involving law enforcement if she returned. It framed police as a tool to establish boundaries and protect staff. Denise reread the line and felt her mouth go dry. They had planned it, not in a dramatic, villainous way, but in a calm, administrative way that was worse. They had anticipated Denise's grief turning into questions, and they had decided the solution was not transparency. The solution was intimidation. Then came an email between the funeral home and the crematory. The crematory manager wrote that the mix-up was their fault. The message included a small admission that their tagging system had been under stress due to staffing shortages. The message referenced a prior incident earlier that month. It referenced a delay in replacing wristbands and tags. Denise felt her throat tighten again. Prior incident. Not a one-off. A pattern. Another email, from the funeral homeowner to the director, said they needed to avoid stating that the ashes were lost. It suggested using language about verification and protocol. It suggested positioning Denise as unreasonable. It also referenced the police call, saying it had been effective. Effective. Denise stared at that word until the letters blurred. Her attorney called her and said he had seen enough to request sanctions. He said the emails suggested the funeral home knew the problem originated internally and still escalated toward accusing Denise to protect themselves. He said the communications also suggested the police call was not based on any credible threat, but on a planned response to pressure her. Denise asked the question she hated asking. She asked whether Harold's ashes were actually Harold. Her attorney paused. Then he said the emails indicated uncertainty at the time, and he needed additional records from the crematory to know what had happened next. Denise felt her heart stumble, not because she was fragile, but because the thought was unbearable. That her husband, who had been careful his whole life, could be reduced to a mislabeled container. That she could spend her remaining years wondering if she brought the right box home. The attorney subpoenaed the crematory. The crematory fought it. They said they were not a party. They said it was burdensome. They said their records were protected. The attorney pushed. The judge allowed limited discovery. More logs arrived. more emails, more evidence of a system under strain. And then, buried in a chain of messages, Denise saw something that made her grip the edge of the table. An internal crematory email referencing an error correction. It described that 2 sets of cremated remains had been placed in temporary containers, then transferred to permanent containers based on tags that later did not match the original intake paperwork. The email referenced a staff member who had tried to fix it quickly. It referenced that the correction was made without a supervisor present. Denise felt her breathing go shallow. Quick fixes. No supervisor. These were the moments where mistakes became tragedies. Another message referenced a later step. A supervisor advised that the funeral home should delay releasing any remains to families until the matter was resolved. He also advised that families should be told the delay was due to protocol, not error. Denise looked down at her hands and realized they were shaking. Protocol. Error. 2 different words for the same reality, chosen based on who needed protecting. Her attorney asked for the funeral home's internal incident report about Denise. The funeral home claimed they did not have one. The attorney requested call logs. The funeral home produced a record showing a call to the police non-emergency line. The call reason was vague. The notes referenced a disruptive person. Denise asked her attorney whether the police had written a report. The attorney requested it. The police department produced a short report noting officers responded to a funeral home, found a distraught woman arguing with staff, and escorted her out at management's request. No threats, no assault, no criminal behavior, just removal. The report, on paper, made Denise look like the problem. The emails behind it showed the truth. As the hearing date approached, Denise's life narrowed to one question. Would anyone in authority say it plainly? Would anyone call out what had been done to her? Because the worst part was not just the ashes, it was the humiliation. The way she had been positioned as a thief in a place that claimed to honor the dead. The way strangers watched her being escorted out like she was dangerous. The way Harold's dignity was treated as negotiable. On the day of the hearing, Denise dressed in black again, not because she wanted symbolism, but because it was what she had. She walked into the courthouse with her attorney beside her. The hallway smelled like old paper and floor polish. People moved with purpose, holding folders and wearing expressions that suggested their day was a series of small wars. In the hearing room, the funeral home's attorney sat at a table, calm and confident. The funeral director sat behind him, face composed. The owner was present as well, wearing a suit that looked more expensive than the furniture in Denise's living room. Denise sat at her table and kept her hands flat on the wood so they would not tremble. The judge entered, and the room rose and sat again. The judge looked tired in the way judges often do, the fatigue of someone who sees conflict constantly and still must act surprised when people lie. The hearing began with procedural issues, motions, objections, discussions of what would be allowed. Then, Denise's attorney began to lay out the timeline. The death, the cremation authorization, the service, the promise of pickup, the sudden delay, the refusal to provide documentation, the accusation that Denise was attempting to steal the ashes, the police call, the humiliation, the months of stonewalling, the eventual production of emails showing internal awareness of a labeling discrepancy and a deliberate strategy to control the narrative. The funeral home's attorney attempted to frame the matter as an unfortunate administrative issue. He emphasized protocol. He emphasized safety. He emphasized that staff had a right to call police if they felt threatened. He emphasized that cremation and identification were sensitive. The judge listened, then asked whether there was any documented threat. The funeral home's attorney referenced staff statements about feeling unsafe. Denise's attorney responded by noting the absence of any police report describing threats and the presence of internal emails recommending calling police to establish boundaries. Then the judge asked for those emails. Denise's attorney handed up copies. The judge read silently. Denise watched the judge's face carefully, not hoping for kindness, hoping for comprehension. The judge's eyes moved across the pages. Once, he paused, then continued, then paused again, longer. The courtroom felt strangely quiet, like everyone was holding their breath without admitting it. The judge asked the funeral home's attorney whether he disputed the authenticity of the emails. The attorney did not. He tried to contextualize them, to soften them, to say they reflected internal brainstorming rather than policy. The judge asked why the emails described police involvement as effective. The attorney shifted and said it was an unfortunate phrasing. The judge asked why the emails emphasized controlling the narrative. The attorney said businesses considered reputation. The judge asked why the emails described Denise as a risk rather than a grieving spouse seeking documentation. The attorney said staff felt pressured. The judge looked up from the emails and asked a question that made Denise's spine stiffen. He asked whether the funeral home knew at the time it called police that the crematory had reported a tagging discrepancy. The funeral home's attorney hesitated, then admitted they had known there was a discrepancy. The judge asked why Denise was not told the truth. The attorney said they did not want to cause alarm. Denise's attorney responded that they caused alarm anyway, but directed it at Denise, not at themselves. The judge asked whether the funeral home had complete chain of custody records. The funeral home's attorney said they had produced what they had. The judge asked whether the crematory's records showed a possibility of remains mix-up. The funeral home attorney argued that the crematory had resolved the issue. Denise's attorney asked the judge to review additional emails from the crematory describing uncertainty and internal correction without supervision. The judge read them as well. Denise felt her heart thud hard as the judge's face tightened. Not outrage, more like disgust in slow motion. The funeral home's attorney tried to pivot again. He argued that Denise had become disruptive in the funeral home. He argued that staff had a right to protect themselves. Denise's attorney then placed the police report into evidence, showing there were no threats described. He placed the call log into evidence, showing vague reasons. Then he placed the funeral home's internal email into evidence describing the police call as a planned boundary enforcement tool. The judge asked why a grieving widow requesting records was treated as a security incident. The funeral director's attorney answered with careful language about emotions running high. The judge asked why those emotions were managed with police instead of transparency. The funeral home had no satisfying answer. Then came the moment that shifted the room from argument to exposure. Denise's attorney introduced the chain of custody email chain, including a message where the owner advised avoiding the word lost and using protocol language to delay release. He introduced another message that referenced the need to position Denise as unreasonable. He introduced the message describing police involvement as effective. The judge read again. The room waited again. Denise saw the funeral director's posture change, a slight stiffening, as if he wanted to disappear behind his attorney. The judge then stated that the communications were troubling. He stated that calling police on a grieving spouse over remains handling raised serious concerns. He stated that the emails suggested the funeral home prioritized reputation management over transparency and dignity. He stated that the refusal to provide chain of custody records, combined with internal references to discrepancies, undermined the funeral home's credibility. He also stated something Denise had needed to hear for months, even if he did not use emotional words. He stated that the funeral home's own documentation indicated the widow was treated as a suspect to control the narrative. Denise felt her eyes burn. She didn't cry. She refused to give them that release in front of them. But she felt something loosen in her chest, like a knot untying after being pulled too tight for too long. The judge ordered further remedies. He ordered additional production from the crematory. He ordered the funeral home to provide a sworn statement about the location and identification of Harold's remains. He ordered the funeral home to cease any insinuations about Denise's wrongdoing absent evidence. He set another date. Outside the hearing, in the courthouse hallway, people moved around Denise like she was invisible. The funeral home's attorney walked quickly away, phone pressed to his ear. The funeral director avoided eye contact. The owner's face was rigid, controlled, as if he were already calculating the next strategy. Denise walked to a bench and sat down. Her attorney sat beside her and said the judge had seen it. He said the emails had done what Denise's voice could not do in that room. Denise nodded slowly. She felt strangely exhausted. Not because the fight was over, because it was not. Because she had spent months living inside a story the funeral home wrote about her, and now, finally, the paper had started to speak for itself. In the weeks that followed, more documents were produced. The crematory, under pressure, provided additional logs and a written explanation. It described a tagging discrepancy and a correction process. It described internal retraining. It described steps taken to prevent recurrence. It did not say what Denise needed most. It did not say with absolute certainty that the ashes were Harold. So Denise's attorney pushed further. He requested the crematory's identification protocols. He requested photographs. He requested witness statements. He requested any verification steps taken after the discrepancy. He requested how the crematory determined which remains belonged to which family when the tags were in question. The crematory's explanations were technical. They referenced process controls. They referenced checks. They referenced cross-referencing paperwork. Denise listened and felt the horror of it, that the identity of a human being could be discussed like inventory reconciliation. Then an email surfaced that changed the case again. It was a message from a crematory supervisor to the funeral home, sent shortly after the discrepancy. It referenced that one set of remains had been released before the discrepancy was fully resolved, due to pressure from the funeral home to avoid delays. Denise felt her stomach drop. Released before resolution. This meant someone, somewhere, may have taken home ashes under the belief they belonged to a loved one when the process was still uncertain. Denise's attorney brought this email to the judge. The The judge's response was not gentle. He ordered a deeper review. He ordered the crematory to provide a timeline and identify all cases potentially affected. He ordered the funeral home to disclose whether any families were notified. He ordered both entities to explain why they did not report the incident to the licensing board immediately. Suddenly, the case was no longer just Denise's. It threatened to become something broader, something that would draw attention, something that would force the funeral home to do what it feared most: admit error publicly. Denise received a call from her attorney a few days later. He said the funeral home wanted to discuss settlement. He said they were willing to offer compensation and a formal apology. He said they were willing to waive all fees and provide additional memorial services. He said they wanted confidentiality. Denise listened and felt a cold anger. Confidentiality. They wanted her silence. They wanted the narrative controlled again. She told her attorney she would not sign anything that prevented her from filing a complaint with the licensing board. She told him she would not sign anything that prevented her from speaking truthfully about what happened. She told him she did not care about their reputation. She cared about Harold's dignity and the way she had been treated. Her attorney told her they would convey that. Another hearing was scheduled. By then, Denise was no longer the woman who walked into the funeral home with a folder and hope that professionalism meant safety. She had become something else, not hardened, but sharpened. Grief had taught her to focus. Humiliation had taught her to document. The months of waiting had taught her that quiet persistence could cut deeper than rage. At the next hearing, the funeral home's tone was different. Their attorney spoke with less swagger. The director looked smaller. The owner looked irritated, like he blamed Denise for forcing him into a world where his internal emails were public. Denise's attorney presented the newly surfaced email about releasing remains before resolution. The judge asked the funeral home whether they pressured the crematory to release cases quickly. The funeral home's attorney attempted to deny, but the email was direct enough that denial would be absurd. The judge asked whether the funeral home notified families who might have been affected. The funeral home admitted they had not. The judge asked why. The funeral home said they believed the discrepancy was resolved. The judge asked how they could believe that while simultaneously advising staff to avoid stating remains were lost and to control the narrative. Silence arrived again, heavier than before. The judge then asked Denise's attorney what remedy Denise sought. Denise's attorney stated that Denise sought accountability, full disclosure, and assurance that the remains she would receive were correctly identified. He stated that Denise also sought consequences for the discriminatory and humiliating treatment she experienced, including the unnecessary involvement of police. The funeral home's attorney attempted to downplay discrimination. He argued that police were called due to perceived disruption, not race. Denise's attorney responded by pointing to the internal email describing Denise as a risk and recommending police to establish boundaries, paired with the lack of documented threats. He argued that a grieving widow was treated as a suspect rather than a client because the funeral home needed to shift blame. He argued that the funeral home leveraged stereotypes about black women being aggressive to make the police call seem reasonable. The judge did not call it stereotypes in his language. Judges rarely do. but he acknowledged that the funeral home's decision-making appeared influenced by assumptions about Denise's behavior rather than documented facts. Denise felt a strange sensation, like standing in bright light after months indoors, exposed, but finally seen. The judge issued orders. The funeral home was required to provide a verified chain of custody statement, signed under oath, and to submit to an audit by the licensing board. The crematory was required to report the discrepancy formally. The court scheduled a compliance review. The judge also indicated that the case could proceed to trial on claims related to emotional distress and wrongful conduct if settlement was not reached under terms acceptable to Denise. Outside the courtroom, the funeral home's attorney asked to speak with Denise's attorney privately. They spoke in low voices. Denise watched from a bench and felt the absurdity of it. Men in suits negotiating over the dignity of a man who had been gentle his whole life. The funeral home offered a settlement without confidentiality. They offered a public apology. They offered to pay Denise's legal fees. They offered a substantial amount for damages. They also agreed to cooperate with the licensing board and implement updated identification protocols, including staffing changes and required training. They admitted, in a carefully worded statement, that they had mishandled communications and that police involvement was inappropriate. Denise wanted to scream that mishandled communications was a weak phrase for what had happened. She wanted stronger words. But she also understood that courts and settlements did not always deliver emotional language. They delivered leverage. They delivered changes. They delivered records. Denise agreed to a settlement that allowed her to file board complaints and speak truthfully. She required that the funeral home's apology be written and included in the board file. She required that the funeral home send notice to any families potentially affected by the discrepancy. She required that the funeral home pay for an independent review of the crematory's processes. She refused to pretend this was simply an unfortunate mistake. The remains were eventually released to her with a new set of documentation. Chain of custody forms, logs, signatures, a detailed explanation of verification steps. Denise held the container and felt nothing like closure. She felt a bitter calm. She felt the exhaustion of a fight that should not have existed. At home, she placed the container on a shelf and sat down at her kitchen table. The same table where she had written Harold's name over and over. The same table where she had turned grief into procedure. She opened a folder marked with the case. Inside it were printed emails, court orders, letters, logs. The paper trail that had saved her from being written off as disruptive. The paper trail that had pulled the funeral home's real priorities into daylight. Denise thought about the first day at the funeral home when she believed professionalism meant safety. She thought about the moment the director implied she was stealing. She thought about the officer's boots on tile. She thought about strangers watching her being escorted out of a place meant for mourning. She thought about Harold's face in the photographs at the service, the calm in his eyes, the way he would have hated the spectacle. She also thought about the judge reading those emails, page by page, and the moment the room's power shifted. Not because anyone felt sorry for her, but because the institution's own words were undeniable. That was the cruel lesson she would carry. Pain was negotiable. Paper was not. In the months that followed, Denise heard from a woman in another town who had seen a news story about the licensing board's investigation. The woman said Her family had experienced a strange delay in receiving remains months earlier. The woman said she never understood why. The woman said the funeral home had told them it was protocol. Denise listened and felt her stomach twist. Protocol. Again. She told the woman the truth as clearly as she could. She told her to request records. She told her to file a complaint. She told her to speak to an attorney if needed. She did not dramatize. She did not soften. She just handed over the tools that had kept Denise from being buried under someone else's narrative. Denise returned to church. She returned to work. She learned how to live in a house where Harold's absence was a permanent shape. Some days she woke up and forgot for half a second, then remembered and felt the familiar stab. Other days she felt nothing at all, and that emptiness frightened her more than sadness. One afternoon, she found Harold's old notebook in a drawer, the one where he wrote down mileage for the car, parts he replaced, dates he rotated tires, little notes in neat handwriting. Evidence of a man who believed that keeping track mattered. Denise smiled once, briefly, and then felt tears rise. Not because she was breaking, because she suddenly understood that Harold's habit of documenting small things had been a kind of love, a way of caring for the future, a way of leaving fewer messes behind. She placed the notebook next to her folder of legal documents, two different kinds of records, both proof of a life lived with care. The funeral home's owner sent a final letter months later confirming changes to policy and acknowledging wrongdoing in a way that sounded like it had been approved by multiple attorneys. Denise read it and set it aside. She did not feel satisfied. Satisfaction was not the right word. She felt something closer to vindication, but even that felt too clean. What she felt most was a quiet warning. If she had not demanded documents, they would have painted her as a thief. If she had not pushed for emails, they would have called it protocol and moved on. If she had not forced the paper trail into court, the truth would have stayed in their inbox. Denise looked at the small container on the shelf and then looked away. Closure was a myth people sold to make grief palatable. What Denise had was something else. A hard, earned form of protection for herself and for other families. She had taken the place where Harold's life was supposed to be honored and dragged it into daylight. Not with screaming, not with vengeance, with documents. Deadlines, court orders, emails. The funeral home had called police to control her. In the end, their own chain of custody emails walked into court and told the truth louder than any siren ever could.